The stool went out from under my hand before I had finished reaching for it. "This is a fighting man's bar, sweetie. Run along." The man who said it was young, maybe 28, built like someone who spent his mornings proving it, and he had positioned himself between me and the rail with the easy confidence of a person who had never once been told no in a room like this one. His friend, younger and slighter, had already slid my stool 3 feet down the bar and was holding it there with one boot, grinning at nobody in particular, waiting to see how I would take it. I had been in the town 4 hours. I had signed for my quarters, read a charter I already knew by heart, and walked out looking for one drink and an early night. I was going to get neither, and some part of me had known that the moment the door swung shut behind me and the noise of the place folded around me like weather. The bar was long and low and dark in the way these places are always dark. Wood gone the color of old coffee, the walls hung with unit patches and framed photographs, and a canoe paddle that had a story I would never hear. It smelled like spilled beer and floor cleaner, and the particular staleness of a room that has hosted a great deal of grief and refused to let any of it show. There were maybe 30 men in it. Most of them were not looking at me. The 2 in front of me were making up for that. "You want the wine place?" the first one said. He had turned to include the room now, the way a man does when the joke is really for an audience. "2 blocks down, nice little spot. Candles. This one's earned if you follow me." I followed him fine. I have spent a long time in rooms where men decide, quickly and out loud, what a woman is for. I stopped arguing with the decision somewhere around my second deployment, not because the argument was wrong, but because it was a losing use of a finite life. You cannot talk a man out of a conclusion he enjoyed reaching. You can only outlast the enjoyment. So I did not tell him what I did for a living. I did not reach for the identification in my back pocket. I did not explain that I had an appointment at 0800 hours the next morning with people whose names he would recognize, and whose respect he had not yet earned. I did none of the things a younger version of me would have done. The version that still believed the truth was a key that opened rooms instead of a thing you carried whether or not anyone let you sit down. I just stood where my stool had been, which was its own small statement, and I looked past him at the bartender. "Bourbon," I said. "Neat. Whatever's open." The bartender was an old man, 70 at least, with a face like a dropped map and forearms that told you he had done real work for real decades. He had been watching the whole thing from under the register with an expression I could not read, and when I ordered, he did not look at the young men to see whether it was allowed. He just reached for a bottle and a glass and poured, and set it down on the bar in the empty space in front of me, exactly where a person would stand if a person meant to stay. The first young man watched the drink land, and something flickered across his face. A small recalculation, gone before it finished. He had expected me to leave. People usually left. That was the whole design of the thing. "Suit yourself," he said, and laughed, and the laugh was for his friend now, a way of handing the moment off before it got heavy. "Just don't get in the way, all right? Grown-ups are talking." "I wouldn't dream of it," I said. The trick, if you want to know it, is not to perform calm. Anyone can perform calm and everyone can tell. The trick is to actually not care what they think and to let them feel the difference, because the difference is unmistakable, and it unsettles men like this more than any speech ever could. A woman who is frightened and hiding it is a familiar object to them. A woman who is simply, genuinely elsewhere is not a thing they know how to move. I lifted the glass. The bourbon was cheap and clean, and I was grateful for both. And across the room, in the corner booth against the far wall, a man I had not looked at yet went very still. I want to be fair to the 2 of them, because fairness is the only thing that makes any of this mean anything, and because I have been unfair to enough people in my life to know the taste of it. They were not evil. They were good at a hard and necessary job, and they were young, and they had been told in 100 ways since they were teenagers that they were the sharp end of everything, and no one had yet done them the favor of proving otherwise. That favor always comes. It was not going to be my job to deliver it tonight, or so I thought, standing at that rail with a drink I had paid for and a stool I no longer had. I had checked in that afternoon at the Joint Command, a low building behind 3 fences with a flag out front and a lobby that smelled like new carpet and old coffee. A staff sergeant had taken my paperwork and my identification and had done the small double take I have learned to ignore. The one that happens when the rank on the card does not match the story a person has already written about the face above it. He had recovered well. Most of them recover well. Then he had walked me back to an office where a colonel I would be working for shook my hand and called me by my rank and told me, without ceremony, that the assignment was going to be harder than the job description made it sound. I was the conventional army's liaison to men who thought the conventional army was furniture. That was the assignment, stripped of its polite language. I would sit in their planning and translate their needs to a system that did not always want to hear them, and translate that system's limits back to men who did not always want to accept them, and I would be, on my best days, useful, and on my worst days, invisible. I had made my peace with that a long time ago. Peace is the wrong word. I had made an arrangement with it, the way you make an arrangement with a bad knee. It had started early. It always starts early. I had been the only woman in my armor officer basic course, and I had learned in the first week that there were 2 ways to be the only woman in the room, and only one of them was survivable. You could spend your energy demanding that people see you correctly, which is exhausting and which never works, because you cannot argue someone into respect. You can only make the withholding of it expensive, and even then they resent the bill. Or you could stop needing them to see you correctly and simply be undeniably good at the job and let the seeing catch up on its own schedule, which is always slower than it should be, and occasionally never arrives at all. I had chosen the second way at 22, and I had never once regretted it, though there were nights, and this was shaping up to be one of them, when the slowness of it wore a groove in me. I had been passed over for a handshake at my own change of command once, the visiting general reaching past me for my executive officer, because he had assumed the man in front of him was the one in charge. I had been asked to fetch coffee at a briefing I was there to give. I had been called the wrong rank so many times that I had stopped correcting it unless the correction served the mission, which it usually did not. None of it had broken me, because none of it was ever really about me. It was about the story the other person had walked in already telling themselves, and I had learned that you cannot edit another person's story from the outside. You can only live your own so plainly that theirs eventually looks foolish next to it. None of that was visible at the rail, of course. That was the whole point of the rail. Standing there in a plain jacket and jeans with my hair down for the first time in what felt like a year, I was exactly the woman the 2 young men had decided I was, which is to say a stranger, which is to say no one, which is to say a person whose presence required an explanation and whose explanation could be waved off with a joke about candles. I looked at them the way you look at weather you have decided to walk through. The first one, the loud one, had the kind of face that photographs well and ages fast. He wore his competence like a jacket he had never taken off, even to sleep. The second one, the younger one with the boot on my stool, kept checking his friend before he committed to any expression, and that told me everything about which of them was the problem, and which of them was going to spend the next 10 years becoming either better or worse, depending entirely on who he chose to stand next to. I was not angry. I want that on the record, because the story is going to turn in a few minutes, and I do not want anyone to think it turned, because I was owed a turn. I was tired. It was a specific and seasoned tiredness, the kind that has nothing to do with sleep. I had driven a great many miles that week, and I had left one life behind and not yet picked up the next one. And I had wanted, very simply, to stand somewhere loud and anonymous, and let the noise wash the quiet out of my head for 1 hour before I became Lieutenant Colonel Dunmore again in the morning. Instead, I was being told to run along. I knew their type. I had commanded their type and been saved by their type. And once, on the worst night of my life, I had gone into a place worse than any of them had ever been to bring their type home. And I had come out of it with 1 fewer soldier than I went in with. I knew exactly what these 2 were capable of on their best day, and it was a great deal. I also knew what they were not yet capable of, and it was the only thing that actually matters in the end, which is the humility to imagine that the person in front of you might be carrying something you cannot see. I had also once buried a man better than both of them. I did not think that to be cruel. It was just true, and standing there, it was the truest thing in the room, and it sat in my chest like a stone I had carried so long I had stopped noticing its weight until a boy with a good face told me to go find the candles. The thing about the worst night of your life is that it does not stay in the past where you file it. It waits. It is patient in a way that nothing else in your life is patient. And it comes back not when you summon it, but when some small, ordinary thing, a smell A phrase, the particular grain of a wooden bar, reaches in and turns the key you thought only you could reach. The spring of 2012. A valley in the east of a country I had better sense than to love and loved anyway, in the way you come to love the ground men die on. I was 27 years old, and I had been a captain for 11 months, and I commanded a cavalry troop, which is to say I was responsible for roughly 100 soldiers, in a column of armored vehicles, and the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. We got the call at last light. I have played it back so many times that I no longer trust my own memory of it. The way a photograph you have handled too often goes soft at the creases. A reconnaissance element was compromised on a ridgeline 9 kilometers north of us. Not ours. A Navy element, small, the kind of men who go to the high ground in the dark and are not supposed to be seen. And they had been seen, and now they were pinned, and the enemy knew the ground better than they did, and was moving to finish it before morning. Air was weathered out. The nearest force that could reach them by road before dawn was mine. I remember the operations officer's voice on the radio, and I remember that even then, with men dying 9 kilometers away, there was a half second of the old music in it, the doubt that follows a woman into every hard room. "You sure you want a troop commander who's never done this before?" someone said, not to me, near me, about me, as if my newness were the variable that mattered and not the 9 kilometers of bad road in the dark. "No one is ever sure," I said, mostly to myself. "You go anyway." We went anyway. I had about 6 minutes to plan it, which sounds like nothing, and is in fact plenty, because the plan for that kind of thing is not complicated, it is only hard. Get there fast, get there before dawn. Take the only road because there was only one road, and accept that the enemy knew there was only one road too, and would be waiting somewhere along it. There is no clever version of driving 9 kilometers up a single track in the dark to reach men who are about to die. There is only the willingness to do it, and the discipline to do it well, and I had a troop full of people who had both, and I told them the situation in 4 sentences over the net, because 4 sentences was all the situation deserved. Men are on a hill. They will die before morning without us. We are the only ones who can reach them in time. We leave in 3 minutes. I gave the order, and the column came alive the way a column does, 100 small competencies firing at once. Men who had been half asleep 90 seconds earlier, now checking weapons and comms, and the men to their left and right, and the vehicles rolled out of the staging area into the last of the light with the particular heavy grace of things that are built to survive being hit. I have loved a few things in my life, without reservation, and the sight of a disciplined unit going to work is one of them. There is nothing like it. All the noise of an ordinary day, the complaints and the small politics and the endless friction of people, all of it just burns off in an instant, and what is left is 30 vehicles and 100 people, moving as one animal toward the worst place any of them will go that year, because someone needs them to, and that is reason enough, and it is the only reason that has ever been enough. Corporal Trace Holloway was up in the gunner's hatch of my vehicle. I need to tell you about Holloway, and I need to do it carefully, because I have spent 14 years failing to do it carefully, and I would like one time to get it right. He was 19. He was from a small town in a flat state, the kind of place people leave and then spend the rest of their lives defending to strangers. He had a way of saying ma'am that managed to be both perfectly respectful and quietly amused, as if he had noticed that the whole apparatus of rank was a little bit ridiculous and had decided to honor it anyway because it made the rest of us feel better. He was the best natural gunner I ever had. Steady hands, steady eyes, a boy who got calmer as things got worse, which is the rarest and most valuable thing a soldier can be and cannot be taught. As we rolled out, he keyed the intercom, and over the noise of the engine and the tracks I heard him, close and dry in my ear. "We're really doing this, ma'am?" There was no fear in it. There was something better than the absence of fear. There was a kind of wonder. The wonder of a 19-year-old who has understood that the next several hours are going to be the realest thing that has ever happened to him and has decided to meet them head up. "We're really doing this," I told him. I have thought about that, yes, every day since. Not because it was wrong. It was not wrong. It was the only order I could have given, and I would give it again tonight, with everything I now know. That is the part that does not get easier. It was right, and it cost what it cost, and both of those things are permanently true. And they do not cancel out, no matter how long you hold them up against each other in the dark. 2 hours later, the first muzzle flash bloomed on the high ground to our left, and then the whole ridge lit up, and the world became noise and light and the specific arithmetic of an ambush, and I stopped being a person and became a voice on a radio doing the only useful thing a commander can do, which is to keep deciding. But that is the ridgeline, and I am getting ahead of myself, because the ridgeline did not stay on the ridgeline. It walked into a bar 14 years later on the face of a man I had last seen at 0400 hours on the worst morning of my life. And I need to go back to the bar now, because that is where he stood up. He stood up slowly. That was the thing that pulled the room before anyone knew why. Not a shout, not a chair thrown back, nothing that reads as an event. Just a big man in the corner booth, rising to his feet with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been hit hard enough that he is not sure his legs are going to hold. And the small wrongness of it, the way it did not fit the easy noise of the place, reached across the bar and touched one person and then another until half the room had gone quiet without deciding to. I saw him then, really saw him, for the first time. He was in his late 30s, though he wore the kind of years that do not photograph as age so much as accumulation. He had a beard going gray at the edges and the flat, economical build of a man who has stayed exactly as strong as his job requires and not 1 ounce stronger for show. He was looking at me the way you look at a word in a language you used to speak, waiting for the meaning to arrive, and I could see the exact moment it arrived because the blood went out of his face all at once and left him the color of the wall behind him. I did not know him. That is the honest truth of it, and I have thought a great deal about what it means. I had carried 6 men off that ridge, and I could not have picked any of them out of a crowd because I had never really seen their faces. Only the shapes of them in the dark and the green wash of night optics and the particular weight of a man who has stopped being able to carry himself. I had saved his life, and I would have walked past him on any street in the world. That is what combat does to the arithmetic of who owes what to whom. It is never even. But he knew me. The loud young seal, Bellamy, I would learn his name was Bellamy, had not caught up yet. He was still riding the last of his joke, still half turned to his friend, and when he saw the senior man rise, he read it the only way his knight had prepared him to read it, which was as backup for a bit that was going well. "Senior, you good?" he said, and there was a grin in it. "It's just some lost tourist. We're handling it." The man in the booth did not answer him. He did not appear to have heard him. He came out from behind the table and crossed the floor toward me, and the room opened for him the way rooms open for a certain kind of man. Not out of fear, but out of a recognition that whatever was happening was his to walk into. And he stopped in front of me at a distance that was closer than strangers stand and further than friends. And for a long second, neither of us was in a bar at all. We were on a ridgeline. We were both, separately, back on the same piece of ground, coming at it from opposite ends. And the 14 years between then and now folded up like a map, and there was nothing between the two moments at all. "It's you," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The bar had gone quiet enough by then that a low voice carried into every corner of it. "You came back for us." 14 years fell through the floor. I had spent all of them not saying his unit's name out loud, keeping that night sealed in a box with a good lid, because opening it did no one any good and cost me something every time. And here was a man I did not recognize as saying the one sentence that only a handful of living people on Earth could say to me and mean it. "You came back for us." 4 words. I had built a whole disciplined life around not needing to hear them, and it turned out I had been starving for them the entire time. I found I could not immediately speak, which is not like me. Behind him at last, the 2 young seals heard the silence they had walked into. I watched it land on them. I watched Bellamy's grin come apart in slow motion as he registered that the senior man's face was not the face of someone playing along, and that the room was not laughing, and that whatever this was, it was not the thing he had thought he was in charge of 5 minutes ago. "Senior," he said again, and now there was no grin in it at all, just the first cold edge of a young man realizing the ground has moved. "What is this?" The man in front of me answered without turning around. "This," he said, "is the officer who is the reason I have a son." Here is what I had not planned for, standing in a bar in a town I had been in for 4 hours. that the worst night of my life was about to be taken out of my hands and set on a table in front of 30 strangers, and that the man doing it would be someone I could not possibly refuse. He told me his name. Silas Rourke, senior chief now, though he did not lead with the rank, he led with the ridge, which told me a great deal about him. He had been a very young man that night, 25, a petty officer on his second deployment, one of the element on the high ground when it all came apart. He remembered things I did not. He remembered the sound of the column before he could see it, the specific low grinding of tracked vehicles pushing hard up a bad road, and how the whole element had gone from counting rounds to counting minutes when they heard it. He remembered a voice on their radio that was calm in a way that had no business being calm, telling them to hold, telling them help was 4 minutes out, then 2, then telling them to get their heads down because the last stretch was going to be loud. That was my voice. I did not remember saying it. He had carried it for 14 years. It is a strange thing to learn that a piece of you has been living inside a stranger. He described the timbre of it, the flatness, and he said that for a long time after that deployment, he could not hear a calm voice on a radio without going somewhere else in his head. He said that on the hill, in the last hour before the column reached them, the calmness of that voice had been the only thing holding the element together. Because a calm voice on the other end of a radio is a promise that someone is still thinking, that the situation has not yet been surrendered to chaos, and men will hold on to a promise like that long past the point where hope would otherwise have run out. He had not known, all those years, that the voice belonged to a woman 2 young men had just tried to send to a wine bar. He had built a picture of the officer in his head, the way you do, and the picture had been a certain kind of man, because that was the only shape the story had ever come in, and here was the story in a completely different shape, standing at the rail, being told to run along. "You don't understand what that voice was to us," he said. "You were just doing your job. I get that. But on our end, it was the difference between men who were going to die scared and men who were going to die fighting, and then it turned out we weren't going to die at all. And that voice was the first sign of it." He shook his head. 14 years, and you were 4 feet away from me the whole night, and I almost didn't look up. "I've told this story 100 times, he said, and he was not really talking to me anymore. He was talking to the room, because the room needed to hear it, and he had clearly decided that. Every guy who came up after me, I told them. There was an army troop that drove into an ambush in the dark to get us off that hill. Straight into it. Nobody made them. Air was down, we were done. And this cav troop just came up the throat of the thing and pulled us out at 4 a.m. He stopped. I never had a name for the officer. 14 years, I never had a name. I want to tell you I stood there and received this gracefully. I did not. I felt the box opening, and I could not close it, and I could not blame the man for opening it. Because to him it was not a box. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The night his life was handed back to him, and here was the person who had done the handing, standing in the same room, alive. Of course he opened it. Anyone would have. But I had kept that night sealed for a reason, and the reason was not modesty. I had sealed it because the story people wanted was a good story, a story with a rescue in it. And the story I carried had a rescue in it, and also had Corporal Trace Holloway going out of the gunner's hatch 100 meters from the objective, and those 2 stories cannot be told at the same volume. The rescue is loud, the loss is quiet. And when you tell them together, in a room, to men who are hungry for the loud part, the quiet part gets trampled, and I had spent 14 years refusing to let Holloway get trampled by his own good ending. So the pressure I felt in that bar was not the social kind. It was not embarrassment. It was the specific claustrophobia of watching something sacred get picked up by well-meaning hands that did not know how heavy it actually was. The 2 young men were stranded now, and I could not help watching them go through it. Bellamy had gone quiet and rigid, a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty, running back through the last 10 minutes and finding, in every one of them, a thing he wished he could take back. And Hoyt, the younger one, the follower, the one who had put his boot on my stool because his friend had made it look safe. Hoyt looked like he wanted the floor to open and take him down through it. He was not a bad kid. I could see that now. He was a kid who had followed the wrong man for one evening and was about to spend a long time thinking about it. Someone at the end of the bar, an older operator with a chief's hardness to him, spoke up into the quiet. "What happened up there, ma'am?" The whole room wanted it. I could feel that. 30 men who lived at the far end of exactly this kind of night, who had all been pinned somewhere at some point and had all prayed, in whatever way such men pray, for the sound of an engine coming up a bad road. They wanted the story the way you want news of a country you love. It was the highest form of attention that room had to give, and it was aimed entirely at me, and I wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I looked at the drink in my hand. I looked at Rourke, who was watching me with the open, wrecked face of a man waiting to finally hear the other half of the night he had only ever known from one end. And I decided how this was going to go. I have made a lot of decisions in my life with a lot more information and a lot more time than I had in that moment, and I am not sure any of them were cleaner. If they were going to have the story, they were going to have all of it. That was the whole of the decision, and I made it in the space of one breath. I was not going to give them the recruiting poster version, the one where the cavalry comes up the road and saves the day and everyone goes home. That version is true, and it is also a lie by omission, and I had watched too many good men get reduced to the loud parts of their own deaths to do that to Holloway in front of a room that would have let me. And I was not going to refuse to tell it either, which was the other temptation, the one that dressed itself up as dignity. I could have deflected. I could have said something modest and turned the attention off and finished my drink and left. And it would have looked like humility, and it would have been cowardice because Rourke had just stood up in front of his whole world and made himself vulnerable to give me something. And to wave that away would have been to tell him the night did not matter enough to speak about plainly. It mattered. It was the thing that mattered most. You do not protect something that matters by refusing to say its name. So I would tell it straight once, and I would put the right name in the room before I put mine. The old bartender moved while I was deciding. I had not asked him for anything. He reached under the bar and came up with a different bottle, something older and better than the one he had poured from before, and he set a fresh glass beside my hand and filled it without a word and without meeting my eyes, and then he set the bottle down within my reach and stepped back. It was the smallest thing. It was a man who had clearly stood where I was standing, in some other bar, in some other decade, and who knew that what I was about to do was going to cost me and that the only useful thing a bystander can offer is cover. Pour the drink, set it down, step back. Let the person do the hard thing with something to hold. I have thought about that old man more than he will ever know. Merle, his name turned out to be. Merle Haskin. He had owned the bar for 30 years, and he had been something in a different war before that, and he ran the place, I would learn, as a kind of unofficial chapel for men who had no other one. And he did not suffer fools, but he had an endless, wordless patience for grief, which he seemed to be able to smell coming through the door. "Take your time," he said, which were the only 3 words he offered the entire night, and they were exactly the right 3. I put the drink down. The room waited. Rourke waited. The 2 young men waited, and they had earned the least right to hear it, and were going to hear it anyway. And maybe, I thought, they were the ones who needed it most, because they were the ones with the most road left in front of them and the least idea yet of what it costs. "Before I tell you anything about that night," I said, and I was surprised at how steady it came out, because inside I was not steady at all. "There is a name that should be in this bar before mine. His name was Trace Holloway. He was 19 years old. He was my gunner. And the reason any of you got to hear a cavalry troop coming up that road is that he was standing up in the open in the hatch of my vehicle, doing his job, while people who wanted us dead did everything they could to make sure he stopped." I looked at Rourke. "You've been telling a rescue for 14 years, I said. "I'm going to tell you the whole thing. It has a rescue in it. It also has a funeral. If you want the one, you take the other. That's the deal. That was always the deal." Rourke nodded, slowly, and something in his face changed, deepened, the way a man's face changes when he realizes the gift he thought he was giving is about to be handed back to him heavier than it left. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I want the whole thing." So I told them. I told it plainly, in the flat voice you use for the things that will break you if you let any music into them. And I am going to tell it to you the same way, because it is the only way I know to carry it across without dropping it. We reached the base of the ridge a little after 0100 hours. The ambush caught us in the last kilometer, on a stretch of road with high ground on the left and a drop on the right, which is the ground you never want and always seem to end up on when it matters. An L-shaped ambush, well laid, patient. They let the lead vehicles into the kill zone before they initiated, which meant whoever ran it knew what he was doing, and for about 90 seconds, it was the worst place I have ever been in my life. And I have been in some places. I will not dress it up for you, because dressing it up is a way of making it about the person telling it instead of the people who were in it. It was noise past the point where noise means anything. It was the inside of the vehicle, lit up in flashes from outside, like the worst weather you can imagine. And the radio full of voices all needing something at once. And the smell of it, which I will not describe, because some of you know it and the rest of you do not need to. It was the specific, private discovery which every person makes alone, and which no amount of training can make for you in advance. That you are more afraid than you thought you would be, and that you are going to have to function anyway. And that the functioning is not the absence of the fear. It is the choice you make on top of the fear, over and over, one decision at a time, for as long as it takes. I found out that night that I could do it. That is not a boast. It is closer to the opposite of a boast, because finding out that you can keep working inside something like that also means finding out what it costs to keep working. And the bill for it comes due later, quietly, over years, in the form of a box with a good lid that you carry into every bar you ever walk into for the rest of your life. I did the only thing there is to do, which is to keep deciding. You cannot make the fear go away. You cannot make the noise stop. All you can do is keep your voice on the radio and keep making the next call and the one after that. Push through or fall back, this vehicle forward, that one to suppress the high ground, and trust that the 100 people who are better at their individual jobs than you will ever be will do those jobs if you can just keep giving them somewhere to point. We had a choice at the worst moment. We could fall back out of the kill zone, reset, and try to find another way up, which would have been the correct decision by every manual ever written, and which would have taken us until well after dawn, by which time the men on the ridge would have been dead. Or we could push, straight up the throat of it, through the last of the ambush, and take the punishment and accept that some of it would land, because on the far side of the punishment were 6 men who had 4 minutes of life left and no other road out. I pushed. I gave the order to push, and my vehicle led it, because you do not send men into a place you will not go first, and Trace Holloway was up in the hatch, putting out fire in every direction as we drove into the worst of it. And he was magnificent. He was 19 and magnificent, and about 100 meters from the objective, a rocket came off the high ground, and it did what those things do. I did not lose him slowly. I want to say that because people imagine last words, and there were none, and the absence of them is its own particular kind of wound. One moment he was above and behind me, a voice and a weight and the sound of his weapon, the whole living fact of him, and the next moment he was not. And the vehicle kept moving because I made it keep moving. Because there were still 6 men on that ridge, and stopping would only have added to the count. We reached them at 0400 hours. We pulled them off the high ground one at a time, some of them walking, some of them not. And we turned the column around, and we brought everyone home, everyone who was still alive to bring. I carried 6 men off that ridge who are still alive tonight, I said to the room. My voice did the thing at last, the small break I had been holding off, and I let it, because Holloway had earned the break, and it would have been another kind of lie to deny him it. I could not carry the one who got me there. He was 19. His name was Trace Holloway. And I have said his name to you before I said one word about a silver star, because that is the correct order, and I am going to ask you to remember it in that order. Nobody in that bar made a sound. I have been thanked and applauded, and I have stood through more ceremonies than I can count. And I am here to tell you that none of it, was worth what that silence was worth. Because it was not the silence of people who did not know what to say. It was the silence of 30 men who knew exactly what I was describing, who had each stood at the edge of that same arithmetic, and who understood that the only honest response to it was to hold still and let it be as heavy as it actually was. That is the highest honor that room had to give, and they gave all of it, and they gave it to a 19-year-old from a flat state who never got to grow old enough to be told to run along in a bar. Rourke was crying without any embarrassment about it, the way only the hardest men can. I've told that story for 14 years, he said, and I never had a name for the officer. I've got it now, and I've got his. Bellamy could not look at me. The loud young man who had told me this was a fighting man's bar was staring at a spot on the floor with the particular fixed intensity of someone who has just understood something about himself that he is going to be a long time forgiving. Nobody told me to run along after that. I almost wished someone would have. It would have been easier to stand in than the thing I was standing in instead. It was Bellamy who came to me first, which surprised me because, in my experience, the loud ones are usually the last to close the distance. He waited until the room had loosened again, until the low talk had come back, and the night had resumed something like its ordinary shape, and then he came down the bar and stood a respectful arm's length away and waited for me to look at him. Up close, he was younger than he had played. That is the thing about the loud ones. The volume is a costume, and when it comes off, you can see how new they still are. "Ma'am," he said. "I didn't know." He said it the way a man says the thing he has rehearsed in the 90 seconds it took him to walk over, and I could have let it stand. It would have been the gracious move, the easy one, to say something warm and let him off the hook and send him back to his friends feeling forgiven. I have watched a lot of senior people take that easy move because it makes the moment more comfortable for everyone, including themselves, and it teaches the young person exactly nothing. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the whole problem. That's the entire thing. Right there. You didn't know." He blinked. He had expected either a fight or a pardon, and I was giving him neither. "You looked at a person you couldn't read," I said, "and you decided that meant there was nothing to read. You decided that what you could see was all there was. And you built a little performance on top of that decision, and you ran it for the room, and it was funny, and it cost you nothing, right up until the moment it cost you everything." I let that sit. You want to know the difference between you and the men you want to be like? It is not fitness, and it is not skill, and it is not how much you can carry. You have all of that. The difference is that the men worth being, assume that every stranger is carrying something they cannot see. They assume it as a matter of habit because they have been the person nobody could read, and they remember what it cost. "Yes, ma'am," he said, quietly. "No costume in it now. I'm not going to report this," I said, "and I'm not going to make it a thing. You know why?" He shook his head. "Because a chewing out you would forget by Thursday," I said. "And I do not want you to forget this by Thursday. I want you to carry it. Not as guilt. Guilt is useless. It's just self-pity, wearing a nicer suit. I want you to carry it as a standard. The next time you see someone in a room who does not obviously belong there by whatever dumb math you did on me tonight, I want tonight to walk up and stand next to you. And I want you to give that person the thing you did not give me, which is the benefit of not knowing. That's it. That's the whole sentence. Can you carry that?" "I can carry that," he said. And I believed him. Or at least I believed the version of him that was standing there at that moment, which is all any of us can ever really believe about a young man. The rest is up to who he stands next to. Hoyt was harder because Hoyt was ashamed in the deep way that can go bad if it is not handled, curdle into resentment, and I was working out how to reach him when Rourke got there first. I watched the senior chief take the younger man aside, over by the wall of photographs, and I could not hear most of it, and did not try to, but I could read the shape of it. It was not gentle. Rourke was not a gentle man, and this was not a gentle lesson. But it was clean, whatever it was, and it ended with Rourke's hand on the back of Hoyt's neck, not a grab, the other thing, the thing that says you are still one of us, and also you are going to be better than you were tonight. And Hoyt nodding, and something in the kid's shoulders coming down from around his ears for the first time since the room had turned. Later, Rourke told me what he had said. He had told Hoyt about the ridge, the parts of it only the men on the ridge knew, the hours of certainty that they were going to die on that hill. And then he had told him that the reason he was alive to be embarrassing himself in a bar was that an officer he had just watched his buddy insult had driven into an ambush to get him, and had lost a boy Hoyt's age doing it. And then he had asked Hoyt a question that I thought was the best thing anyone said all night. He asked him, Rourke told me, what he thought Holloway would have done if some stranger walked into his bar, whether Holloway would have taken her stool. I had to turn away when he told me that, because I knew the answer, and so did Rourke, and so, now, did Hoyt. Trace Holloway would have given a stranger his own stool and bought her the first drink and never once needed to know whether she had earned it. That was the whole of who he was. He did not measure people at the door. It is the thing I miss most about him, and it is the thing I have tried and mostly failed to be in the 14 years since. And a senior chief handed it to a 25-year-old in a bar as the standard to reach for. And I do not think I have ever been prouder of my worst night in my life. They would remember this longer than any chewing out. That was the idea. That was the only idea I'd ever had about how to handle men like these. And it turned out I did not even have to be the one to deliver it, which is its own kind of grace. Before the night was over, Bellamy came back one more time. He had a beer he did not drink in his hand, and the careful posture of a man who has something else to say and is not sure he has the standing to say it. I let him find his way to it. My grandfather was Army, he said finally. Infantry. He never talked about it. He died when I was 12, and I always figured, I always figured the Army was where you went if you couldn't cut it for something better. I don't know where I got that. I think I just needed it to be true so I could feel like I'd picked the hard road. He looked at the floor. That's an ugly thing to admit. It's an honest thing to admit, I said. That's rarer, and it's worth more. He'd have taken your stool too, Bellamy said. My grandfather, he'd have given you his and stood the whole night. I never understood why my grandmother talked about him like he was some kind of saint. He was just a quiet old man to me. He was quiet for a moment. I think I understand it a little better tonight. I did not fix that for him. Some things a person has to sit inside of for a while, and the sitting is the whole point, and if you rush in to make it comfortable, you rob them of the only part that changes anything. So I let him stand there with his grandfather, whom he was meeting for the first time at 28 in a bar, and I finished my drink, and after a while he nodded to himself and went back to his friends a different man than the one who had taken my stool, or at least the first draft of a different man, which is all any of us ever gets to be on a single night. There is a thing nobody tells you about being recognized, and it is this. It does not heal you. It is not the same operation. I had spent some part of 14 years imagining, without ever letting myself say it plainly, that if the right person ever knew what that night had cost, if the debt were ever properly seen, something in me would be allowed to finally set the weight down. And here, in a bar in a town I had been in for 4 hours, the right person had known, in front of 30 witnesses, and the weight had not moved an ounce. It had only become visible. That is all recognition does. It turns the light on. It does not carry anything for you. I found a table in the back corner, later after the room had absorbed the whole thing and gone back to being a bar, and Merle brought me one more drink I did not intend to touch, and I sat with the box I had opened for the room still open, privately now, just for me. Holloway at 19, in the hatch. We're really doing this, ma'am. The wonder in it, the complete, head-up, unafraid wonder of a boy meeting the realest hours of his life. I do not cry easily, and I did not cry then, but I sat with him for a while, which is the closest thing to prayer that I have. I let myself remember the whole of him, and not just the loss of him, which is the discipline that took me the longest to learn, because grief is lazy, and it wants to reduce a person to the manner of their leaving. He was not a death. He was a boy with a dry sense of humor and steady hands who called me ma'am like it was a small shared joke between us. He liked terrible music and defended his flat home state to anyone who would listen, and he was going to be somebody. He was already somebody, and the world is measurably worse for not having gotten to keep him. And no silver star pinned to my chest a year later ever weighed as much as that one plain fact. Rourke came and sat down across from me after a while. He did not ask if he could, he just sat, two people who had been on the same ridge from opposite ends, and for a long time neither of us said anything, which was correct. We named him, he said finally. I looked up. My son, he said. Middle name, Trace. I didn't know the whole story until tonight. I just knew there was a gunner. Our guys who came off that hill, we always knew there'd been a gunner who bought it getting us out. So when my boy came, I put it in there. Trace. I've got a 9-year-old walking around with your gunner's name in the middle of his, and until about an hour ago, I did not know that name belonged to a real kid named Holloway from a flat state. He shook his head slowly. He's got it now. My boy. I'm going to tell him tonight who he's named after. The whole thing, the right order like you said, the name before the medal. I have received a great many things in my life. I have never received anything like that. There are 6 of us, Rourke went on, and his voice was steady now, the steadiness of a man laying down something he has clearly needed to say for 14 years and never had the person to say it to. 6 of us you pulled off that hill. I keep track. That's the thing you don't get to see, ma'am, from your end. You see the one you lost. You've been seeing him for 14 years, I can tell. I know the look. But you don't get to see the other side of the ledger, and I do, because I'm on it. 6 of us. Between us, we've got, I think, 11 kids now. One of the guys, his daughter just started college. Another one's a grandfather. A grandfather. He was 22 on that hill, and he's got grandkids now, because you drove up that road. He said the word, grandkids, and I had to look away. Out the dark window at the empty street, because it was the best thing anyone had said to me in years, and I did not have anywhere to put it. That is the cost of the win, I think, if I am honest about the accounting. I walked into that bar carrying one dead boy, sealed up tight, and I walked out still carrying him, because you do not get to set that down, not ever. That is not how it works. But I also walked out knowing there were 11 children in the world and a grandfather who were downstream of a road I drove up one night when I was 27 and terrified. Both ledgers are real. They do not cancel. I have stopped waiting for them to cancel. You just carry both, and some nights the second one is heavy enough to help you carry the first. And that, it turns out, is as close to healed as this particular wound is ever going to get, and it is enough. It has to be. I have decided that it is. I reported to the Joint Command the next morning at 0800 hours, exactly as scheduled, in the uniform I had come to town to wear. And I want to tell you that everything was different, and I want to be honest that almost nothing was. And both of those are true in the way that the 2 ledgers are true. I walked into that headquarters as exactly the same officer I had been the night before. Same rank, same record, same assignment. Nobody had wanted to give a conventional Army liaison. I had not gained a single qualification between the bourbon and the coffee. The only thing that had changed was who was willing to see it, and it turned out that changed more than I would have predicted, because a base town is a small town, and a story like that does not stay in one bar overnight. By the time I got to the operations floor, they knew, not the details. The men who had been in the bar were not the kind to broadcast the details, and Rourke least of all. But they knew there was an Army officer coming who had a ridgeline in her past that the teams remembered, and the room I walked into was not the room I had braced for. Nobody made a show of it. That is not how these things work. It was subtler than that, and it was in everything. It was in the way the first hard question I got in the first meeting was a real question and not a test. It was in the fact that when I gave an assessment they had not wanted to hear, they were annoyed at the assessment instead of at me, which is the entire difference. That is the whole ballgame, and most people never get to stand on the good side of that line in a room like that one. I did not fool myself that I had earned it that morning. I had not. I had earned it 14 years earlier on a road in the dark, and it had simply taken this long and this particular chain of small chances for the earning and the seeing to finally arrive in the same room. That is the part they do not tell you either. The recognition, when it comes, is almost never for the thing that is in front of you. It is a very old debt, being paid late, by people who only just found out they owed it. And I will be honest with you about the temptation that came with it, because I think the temptation is the more useful thing to talk about than the reward. It would have been very easy, that first week, to let the story do my work for me. A reputation is a kind of currency, and I had just been handed a great deal of it overnight, and there is a version of me, a worse version, who would have spent it. Who would have let the ridgeline stand at the front of the room in every meeting so that no one questioned her? Who would have traded on the debt instead of the day's actual work? I had seen officers do exactly that. Coast for years on one hard night a decade gone, and turn slowly into a story they told about themselves instead of a person who still showed up. I decided that week that I was not going to be that. The ridgeline was Holloway's and Rourke's and the 6 men and their 11 children. It was not a tool for making my Tuesdays easier. So I did the thing you have to do, which is to walk into every room as if no one knew, and to earn the meeting on the merits of the meeting, and to let the old story be a private weight rather than a public lever. It is harder that way. It is also the only way that lets you keep looking at yourself. And in the end, that is the only audience whose opinion you cannot walk away from, because it follows you home. Rourke found me at the end of that first week. He was waiting by my vehicle in the headquarters lot, out of uniform, holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed me one without a word, which was becoming, I realized, the language between us, the bartender's language. Pour the drink, set it down, step back. Say the important thing with your hands. I've got a proposal, he said, and you can say no. Go ahead. The anniversary's in the spring, he said. That night. We've never marked it, the 6 of us. Not together, not really. Everybody just gets quiet that week and nobody says why. He looked at me. I want to do it right this year, at Merle's. The 6 of us, and you, and we say his name out loud. Trace Holloway. On purpose. Not because we bumped into it in a bar. Because we chose to. And we tell my boy and any of the other kids who are old enough, who they've got to thank that they've got a dad. I did not answer right away because I did not trust my voice. And he was kind enough to let the silence go on until I had it back. We pick a date, I said finally. We pick a date, he agreed. We picked a date. It is in the spring, and it is his, Holloway's, and I have kept it every year since, in a bar owned by an old man who says 3 words a night, and all of them the right ones, with 6 men who are alive to raise a glass, and 1 boy with my gunner's name in the middle of his, and we say the name before we say anything else, because that is the correct order, and because a 19-year-old from a flat state taught it to me without ever knowing he was teaching me anything at all. I want to say something to you before I go, and I want to say it to one person in particular, whoever you are out there tonight who has been the stranger a room decided did not belong in it. Maybe it was a bar, maybe it was an office, or a family table, or a uniform they did not think you had the right to wear, or a title they could not make fit the face above it. Maybe someone looked at what they could see of you and decided that was all there was, and told you, in one of the 100 ways people say it, to run along. Here's the thing I learned, standing at that rail with my stool 3 feet down the bar. Your worth was never up for a vote at the door. It was not theirs to grant, and it was not theirs to withhold, and the fact that they could not see it changed exactly nothing about whether it was there. You do not have to prove it. You do not have to flash the card or tell the story or win the room. I stood there and let 2 young men be wrong about me, and it cost me nothing, because I already knew what I was carrying, and a person who knows what they're carrying does not need the room to know it too. But I will tell you the other half, because it is the half that took me longer. When someone finally does see you, let it in. Do not armor up against the good the way you armored up against the bad. I spent 14 years so braced against being diminished that I had almost forgotten how to be recognized. And when it came, I nearly deflected it out of sheer habit, and that would have been its own quiet tragedy. Let the good land, you are allowed. And whatever you carry, whoever got you here, say their names. Out loud, in the right order, before the medals and before the credit and before your own name if it comes to that. The people who told you to run along will not remember you by Thursday. But the ones who got you to the door, the ones who are not here to be told to run along themselves, those are the ones worth building the whole rest of your life around remembering. His name was Trace Holloway. He was 19. He gave strangers his stool. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I will see you next time.